Yeah, so welcome everyone to this Menopause at Work network meeting. As I mentioned to a few others a little bit earlier, it did kind of feel a bit weird this morning, pressing on with business as usual when there are so many crises happening in the world and in Australia. But then when I thought about it a little bit more, it's like, gosh, you know, when we are faced with massive stress and crisis, our health becomes even more important. You know, it's our primary source of resilience and coping. And really that's what today is all about, how to make it easier for women to take care of their health during a particular life transition. Just so you know, I am on the mid-north coast and I am fine flood-wise, but we have had a few power outages. And I just want to say, I think we're going to be all good today. But if it blacks out just for a moment, I've got all my backup plans here, the laptop and my phone to hotspot, so don't go away. It'll only be a moment or two before we reboot. For those of you I haven't met, I'm a workplace wellbeing advisor and I specialise in supporting the wellbeing of midlife working women. And so I help workplaces become menopause friendly through staff education and manager training and also consulting. And the purpose of these particular meetups are for workplace professionals to come together to connect and share ideas and, you know, learn from each other, sometimes learn from experts as well. And that's why we're really glad to have Nicola here today. And because menopause is still a relatively new item on workplace agendas, I just think it's really great to connect and share resources rather than reinvent the wheel. To give you an idea of the format of today, because it is a network meeting, we're just going to have a really quick, 5-minute breakout room. Imagine you're at a workshop and you go to, across and say hello to someone before the workshop kicks off. So I'll just be, hi, this is who I am, and just share what got you here today. Now, if for some reason you really don't want to be part of the breakout room, that's cool. There's a little leave room button at the bottom, but really this is just about connecting with other people, which at the moment I think is more important than ever before. We'll have about a 20-minute presentation from Nicola, who I'll introduce very soon, and then we'll have a good half hour to really unpack this topic. So jot down your questions, and if you've got any specific issues you'd like to bring, that would be fantastic, because then we're able to make this all the more relevant to you. Let's jump in and get stuck into this topic of employment law and menopause. So while I do encourage workplaces to become menopause friendly, because it's just a smart business move in the context of an ageing population, it increases engagement and retention of some of your most experienced staff. Of course, it also helps to understand what our obligations are. And also in the context of International Women's Day, which is all about break the bias, I was really interested when I did my one-on-one confidential interviews with working women, how so many of them said that they felt there was an unconscious cultural bias against menopausal women. I'll just read out one quote. One woman said, "There's an unconscious bias that menopause means you're going into the last stage of your career. There is a stigma that this signals the end. You're not as sharp, you're not at your career peak." Another woman said, "I don't feel it's something I can talk about openly without experiencing discrimination." So it's fantastic to have Nicola Martin here today to help us understand how organisations can avoid discriminating against women. So Nicola, welcome. Nicola is a partner in the Labour and Employment Group at Patton Bogs, and she's based in Sydney at the moment. And, Nicola's kindly, offered her time here today because she has a special interest in women's health and really likes to help employers find ways to better support women. But Nicola, thanks so much for helping us unpack this topic of how employment law actually applies to menopause. So, yeah, welcome.
Thanks, Thea. So I'm going to try and share my screen and bring some slides up.
There's always a moment, isn't it?
Yes, there is a moment. Okay, can we see them?
Yes, that's looking great.
Excellent. And I'm just going to try, I'll go on to the next slide so we can check that that's working. There we go. Great, super. Thanks so much for inviting me along, Thea. What you say is so true, and the opening, I suppose I just don't want to just talk about legal issues today, but looking at it holistically and reflecting on why the menopause is a workplace issue. So kicking off, you very kindly let me steal one of your some content from your website, which I think sums it up really, really nicely. In terms of breaking down why menopause is a workplace issue. Now, as we know, and as Thea touched upon, we now know that women over 45 make up about 17% of the Australian workforce. So we know from a demographic point of view that that is not an insignificant amount of women. But we also know, unfortunately, that a number of women at that age and that stage in life do consider dropping out of the workforce because they feel they're not able to manage their symptoms at work, and because they don't feel able to have those open and honest conversations with their managers or their HR departments. Worst case scenario, those women feel like they need to drop out of the workforce entirely. And I think some statistics from the Australian Menopause Society have said that around 10% of women in that age bracket drop out of the workforce entirely. And when you look at how women's participation rates in the workforce have changed over the last, say, 40 years, we now know that in that age bracket of between 55 and 64, the rate of workforce participation has gone from 20% to 60% over the past 40 years. And with many of you here today in HR, you'll know about the war on talent, attraction and retention issues, and why, not just to be a good corporate citizen and not just from a social responsibility perspective and not just from a legal compliance perspective, that ultimately it makes good business sense. And that's how you will get the leaders and the people with the purse strings to listen to you when you're bringing these areas to their attention and you want support within your organisation. And we'll look at some of those sort of business drivers and the bottom line considerations a little bit later in the discussion. But I am a lawyer and I'm an employment lawyer. So obviously I'm going to talk about the legal bits a bit first and take you through some of the legal considerations. Which again might help you if you are advocating within your organisation to have more support from a health and wellbeing perspective to the particular initiative around menopause and related issues. So the overarching relevant law is really the work health and safety legislation. And the main aim of that legislation in every territory and state in Australia is to ensure, so far as reasonably practicable, the health and safety of workers. So a couple of examples of the legislation up there on the slide. Victoria is now the only state in Australia that hasn't harmonised its work health and safety legislation. WA is just coming into the harmonised system as of this month. And so really the work health and safety legislation in each of the states and territories apart from Victoria is now harmonised and is extremely similar. And as I say, it's the primary duty in that legislation is to ensure, as far as reasonably practical, a healthy and safe workplace. And you'll see up there on the slide the reference to the PCBU. That's the person conducting a business or undertaking. So for most of us, that is the employer, but it will also include officers and directors of the organisation. And again, sometimes that is a way for you to get buy-in from the executive and the board. They have those potential personal liability as directors insofar as these health and safety obligations are concerned. So when we look at that obligation in the context of menopause, it might arise in the sense of needing to provide sufficient temperature controls or ventilation or access to appropriate toilet and changing facilities. Things that you would hope most of us can take for granted in the workplace and hopefully most of us can in an office-based environment. But when you step outside into a warehouse or a manufacturing environment, then unfortunately not all workers do have access to those facilities. So there's those types of sort of practical and sort of physical control measures. And then you've also got obviously the people management side of it from a work health and safety perspective. So making sure your people managers are educated and trained, and so they have an understanding of the issues to ensure that conversations can happen and issues can be addressed, hopefully sensitively, without any sort of risk of allegations of bullying or harassment or discrimination coming into the mix. But unfortunately, there is still the reality that there is a potential for discrimination claims in the way that employers handle or don't handle menopause-related issues. And up there on the slide are the three most, I think, obvious forms of discrimination. that someone could allege as they relate to the menopause. A woman could certainly argue that she's being less favourably treated because of the menopause or some symptoms she's experiencing, less favourably treated than a man with some other sort of medical condition. And there's definitely been case law. There's been very, very little case law in Australia, but there is a body of case law now coming out from the UK through their employment tribunal. And there have been age discrimination claims, sex discrimination claims, and disability discrimination claims brought in the UK tribunal relating to menopause-related issues. In one particular case, a woman alleged that she believed that she'd been performance managed because of, or a reason relating to her menopausal symptoms. So, as we all know, poor concentration, lack of memory can be symptoms of the menopause. And this female said that she was being less favourably treated because she was being performance managed. And she said the reason that her performance wasn't up to scratch was because of her symptoms arising out of the menopause. She said that a comparable man with some other sort of medical condition wouldn't have been treated in the same way, wouldn't have been subjected to that performance management process. And in that particular case, that the tribunal found in her favour. Quite often, the claims that arise out of sex discrimination will also allege age discrimination, because obviously the age range during which the majority of women go through the menopause places them in the sort of the 50 years and up age bracket. And in the UK, we've actually seen a tripling of menopause-related claims in the last 3 years. And just this week, there was another decision coming out from the Employment Tribunal in London. The tribunal awarded £20,000 to a woman who admittedly, she brought an unfair dismissal claim as well as age and sex discrimination claims against her former employer. And the age and sex discrimination elements of her claim related to her male boss shouting at her something along the lines of, "Oh, she must be in the menopause," in a public forum in front of a customer. So she alleged that he'd made inappropriate and derogatory remarks about her age and her sex. Obviously, it was because it was menopause, it was related to her age and her sex. And she felt he had a perception, or that he'd guessed that she was of an age that might be a funny or appropriate comment to make. She basically asked him to stop making the comments, and he carried on. She complained to his wife, who was also involved in the running of the business, and about a month later, she was sacked for performance-related issues. So more and more, unfortunately, we are seeing those types of cases coming through the tribunals in England, and I think it's just a matter of time before we start seeing them in Australia, as menopause in the workplace is only just really starting to become a topic of conversation and a relevant issue in workplaces in Australia. So disability discrimination is also in the mix, but I think it's worth noting at the outset that the menopause in itself is not a disability, but there is definitely the possibility that symptoms or medical conditions arising out of the menopause could meet the definition of a disability. So I thought it was just useful if I actually talk a little bit about the definition of a disability. This is the definition from the federal legislation. And so it's a physical or mental impairment which has a substantial and long-term adverse impact on a person's ability to carry out normal day-to-day activities. Now, that obviously won't mean that every symptom or every medical condition that relates to the menopause qualifies as a disability. But we know for some women, certainly, that I think on average the menopause lasts around 4 years, but for others it goes on much, much longer, and particularly if you take it from perimenopause right through to being postmenopausal. And so that being the case, it's definitely not beyond the realms of possibility that, depending on how those symptoms manifest and how serious they are and the impact they have on a woman's ability to carry out her day-to-day life, that she could have a disability for the purposes of the discrimination legislation. And if that is the case, then an employer has an obligation for someone who has a disability to make reasonable adjustments to their role in order to enable them to perform the inherent requirements of their role. Now, in a simple case, that reasonable adjustment could be providing a fan or the changing facilities. It could be allowing someone to start later in the day if they've had a disturbed night's sleep. And luckily, obviously, we're seeing a lot more flexibility coming through COVID anyway. But the important point to note about reasonable adjustments is the law assumes an adjustment is reasonable unless the employer can demonstrate that it would cause them an unjustifiable hardship to make the adjustment. So it's not for the employer to say, well, we don't consider, objectively speaking, that that's a reasonable adjustment that you're seeking. Unjustifiable hardship is a fairly high bar. So it doesn't just involve the actual costs that the adjustment might cause the employer to incur. It's more holistic. It looks at the impact of the adjustment on other employees, both from a health and safety perspective, from an operational perspective. It looks on, I suppose, the benefit to the person who's got the disability versus any adverse consequence on other colleagues. So yes, the financial burden comes into it, but it's by no means alone just the finances. So, if you take a perhaps extreme case where a female or a woman asks if the employer could install air conditioning into the office, then it's obviously going to depend on the employer's means as to whether that might cause them an unjustifiable hardship. Or a small business with perhaps only a couple of employees, not with massive turnover, that may well cause them an unjustifiable hardship. But for a large corporation, you can see how, relatively speaking, that probably wouldn't be a defence to that type of adjustment being sought. So just something to bear in mind when you're thinking about adjustments, or particularly if you're asked about an adjustment by an employee. And I just wanted to touch upon the rights of both the employer and the employee when it comes to the right to request flexible working. Now, obviously, as I said, with COVID and the disruption that's caused, and how many of us have worked from home and who've worked flexibly because we've been juggling other demands, including homeschooling, we've probably jumped 20 years forward in terms of flexibility, as compared to how long it might have taken us to get there had it not been for COVID. But I think it's just worth circling back to who actually has the right, which employees actually have a right to request flexible working under the legislation, because that's not all employees. So the right to request a flexible working arrangement sits in the National Employment Standards and the Fair Work Act, which most of you will probably know is our primary piece of employment legislation. And it sets out that employees with more than 12 months service, continuous service, have the right to request a flexible working arrangement if they have a carer of a school-aged child, if they're a carer under the Carers Recognition Act, if they have a disability, if they're over 55 years of age, or they're experiencing domestic violence, either themselves or someone else in their household. So those categories are still relatively limited, especially when you think about the fact that many women who go through the menopause are not 55 or over. And you've got to bear in mind the limitation that this is just a right to request. It's not an absolute given that an employer has to provide flexibility, albeit an employer can only decline a request if it has reasonable business grounds to do so. And we're certainly finding that in a world where we've had a lot more flexibility now, it's actually a much higher bar for an employer to say it does have genuine operational reasons as to why it can't grant some sort of form of flexibility. And certainly in my experience, and I would imagine it's the same in many of your organisations, I'm tending to find that more employers are opening up their flexible work policies to the whole workforce, not just those who are entitled to the right to request under the legislation. That being said, I think there's still some benefit. I get asked, as someone in HR or somebody in WHS or a wellbeing consultant, should I still be advocating for a separate menopause-related policy, as well as just having a flexible work policy? And I do think there's still some real benefits to having a policy. I think it, up there on the slide, some of the benefits, I think it shows an absolute commitment by the employer, that they know it's an issue, they recognise it's an issue, and they're prepared to have those conversations. It's all about empowering workers to feel comfortable having the conversations and raising the issue, to help break down the stigma that we know discussions around menstruation and menopause cause people to have. There still is that stigma. And we're just getting to the point where, after many years, the stigma relating to mental health is being broken down. And I think from the next conversation we need to start having is how we do the same for menstruation and menopause related issues. The policy provides a great starting point to be able to have discussions and conversations. And if you've got policy, also in turn, you're much more likely to then have some guidance or some training for managers in the policy, and helping them understand how they can have conversations. Whether that's just giving them examples of openings, like, are you okay? You've not seen yourself recently, rather than going straight in there and saying something that might be inappropriate, like, oh, you're 55, is it? You having women's troubles. And so lastly, I just wanted to touch on some of those business benefits that we looked at the beginning. We know for a fact that if workers are feeling supported and have conversations and can ask for some flexibility, there will end up being reduced absenteeism, increased morale. It helps attract and retain staff. We don't see the same dropout rate in women of that 55 to 64 age bracket. And ultimately, with our war against talent and salaries rising, we know that people, when they go to look for a new job, are not just looking for the best salary. They're looking at holistically the working conditions. And where they will do, as you will know, they do their research. They do their research into the benefits to flexible working arrangements, flexible working policies. And increasingly, we're seeing people interested in this area as well. What do you do? What do you do as an organisation for females, or for women experiencing the menopause? And we're just talking in the breakout room there with Deb, and I was saying that I moved law firm about a year ago, and I came from a law firm where this just wasn't a topic that had been broached at all. And I'd already been doing some work with Thea at that stage. And then I came to Squire Patton Bogs a year ago, and albeit it's got a lot of resource behind it, it's a global law firm. I was delighted to see the amount of material, and there's a whole initiative around menopause in the workplace at Squires. It's got a selection of material. There's manager training, there's webinars, there's guidance notes, there's how to start conversation guidelines, and it makes such a difference actually arriving into an organisation where you know that you're not starting from scratch in terms of getting people's attention and getting people's support. And I say that not as an employment lawyer, I say that as an employee as well. And ultimately that all leads to brand enhancement, which is obviously never a bad thing. So it's getting, as I say, it's getting the leaders to sit up and take notice and realise that it can ultimately be a bottom line issue. So I think that's the end of the formal part of the presentation. So looking forward to having a chat with you all about it. Thanks, Thea.
Yeah, great. Thanks for putting those headline items up for us, Nicola. We will have Q&A, and yeah, thanks. We might just keep it to the video. So this is where we'd just love to see if anyone's got any questions or comments. So you can either grab the microphone, and in which case, just pop up your hand and I'll call out your name. Or if you do want to share something in the chat box instead, you could use that. Completely up to you what you feel most comfortable with. But does anyone have any top of mind questions? Doesn't matter how simple or straightforward they are, or any comments they want to make. And just while you're thinking about that, yes, I was delighted, Nicola, I spoke to your HR person just a couple of days ago, and she was saying how you've actually had that menopause policy there for a couple of years, which is fantastic. And
yeah, no, I was speaking to her about it recently, and
yes,
I'd asked how long it had been a thing and an initiative, and yeah, so a couple of years in Australia, I was pretty forward thinking.
Yes. I know Clayton Utz is another law firm I did some manager training with lately, so it's great to see the first cabs off the rank. So yeah, please take a moment to think about the question here. We've got, a top lawyer ready to answer all your questions. But again, while you're thinking about that, I know one area that gets a little bit blurry for me, Nicola, is performance management and supporting an employee's well-being.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm just trying to think of a scenario, but let's just say someone's performance has been slipping,
Mm-hmm.
and the performance management process is started. Then we discover, she is being affected by menopause. Do we then kind of pause the performance management process and say, okay, let's focus on your well-being for a certain period of time and see how things change? Or is there anything to be aware of?
Yeah, that's what I would be advising. And I would hope, although I recognise it wouldn't always be the case, that when a performance management conversation starts, there would be a conversation around health and well-being, almost as a precursor to a formal performance management process starting. So, as I mentioned, that conversation around, are you okay? You haven't seen yourself recently, or, we have seen a bit of a difference in the quality of your work. Is everything okay? Is there anything that you want to talk to us about? And set the scene in that context so that, if the employee says, no, everything's fine, you can go ahead with that performance management conversation. Or if the employee says, well, no, actually I am, I'm struggling, and starts talking about perhaps some of their symptoms in this area, then it's not to say that there can't still be a monitoring of the performance. But as an employer or somebody who was advising an employer, I would be saying, well, does this person need adjustments? So it doesn't really matter whether they've formally got a disability under the legislation. You're going to have to look at this. You can't just look at the performance issues without looking at it holistically and what else is going on. So could the performance issues be related to a symptom like poor concentration, lack of sleep, that type of thing? And would it make a difference allowing that person to start an hour later, or them saying, look, I just get really foggy headed early afternoon, I'm going to take a couple of hours off then and then work later in the evening when I'm feeling a bit more on top of it. So just being able to have those conversations and then say, well, okay, let's look at the adjustments, and once we've made the adjustments, then let's monitor and see if there's actually been an improvement. But if you're not empowered to have that conversation about the well-being piece at the start, then you can just see how it goes. It derails immediately. Performance management process kicks in, person feels bullied or harassed, goes to see a lawyer or speaks to somebody who knows somebody who says, oh, hang on a minute, this sounds like discrimination or bullying and harassment. The grievance is lodged, and it's very difficult to get it all back on track from there, and to continue having some sort of functional working relationship.
So what I'm hearing that is also the ability to have those early conversations about health and well-being can prevent it becoming a really difficult performance management issue later on. Is that right?
Absolutely.
And also, I think you're also making the point that you don't have to wait to see if it is classified as a disability. Start looking at those simple workplace accommodations irrespective, because it is going to help the woman work better. And worst case scenario, if it did become a legal case, you would have been seen to have been doing the right thing anyway as a workplace. So do you think that's kind of a good mindset to adopt, regardless of, whether her symptoms are so severe to be counted as a disability? Just explore the adjustments anyway.
Yeah, no, I do, because, the worst case for the employer is that it is or it becomes a disability, and you're in the situation of being legally required to look at it from an adjustment perspective. Best case scenario, as you say, it stops a potentially lengthy, protracted, difficult process unfolding. I think that just makes good business sense and good sort of people management sense.
And the good news is that a lot of the adjustments are actually really inexpensive and quite simple. Yes, I mean, air conditioning is the big ticket item, which actually a lot of women would like. But other things, it can be as simple as really sanctioning regular breaks or some distraction-free time if you're having trouble with multitasking and focus. Or so that's the good news, I guess, about the adjustments as well.
And I think it'd be really interesting anecdotally to see what women are saying now, given that so many of us do have more flexibility on how we structure our days, and whether that's because we're at home more, or because we work at odd times of the day and night that suit us, whether we're actually seeing any sort of meaningful impact on people with menopausal symptoms.
Yeah.
Have you heard anything anecdotally about that?
I've heard that just in terms of the whole working from home thing, a lot of women have said it's made it a lot easier for them to manage their symptoms.
Yeah.
And then on the flip side, there's been the intensification and people working longer hours, and any kind of stress is going to make the symptoms worse. So a bit of a mixed bag there. Yeah. I'm just checking here, chat box, or any questions here that you'd like to throw in. You can pop your hand up if you'd like to grab the microphone. But just, while things are a little bit quiet, I'd just like to throw out a question to the audience. And if you could just type in the chat box, if you think about your workplace, how comfortable or not would you feel raising this issue if you felt you were affected by menopausal symptoms with your manager? So you can either type comfortable or uncomfortable, and any variations on that. I'd just be really interested to see, how you would feel in your own workplace. So, do you feel like you've got a culture where you can speak up and you feel comfortable, you can jot that down, or some degree of discomfort? And if there is discomfort, it's always interesting to explore what's behind that. So someone's saying very comfortable with your immediate boss, which is great because they have the biggest impact, don't they, on your day-to-day work. A little bit cautious, that's understandable. One woman described to me, who went through one of my other programs, she said, I need to manage the story for myself around my experience of menopause, which is totally fine. Very comfortable, but I have a female manager, which makes it easier. Just on that though, I have also heard some senior female leaders say things like, it's just an excuse for poor performance, which highlights that there's a real need to increase understanding between women, because some women don't have any trouble with it and it's not a big deal. This is great. We're seeing, so Rebecca, I've been fortunate to have a conversation with my manager, but that may not be the case across the whole business, and not comfortable.
And Thea, Deb and I were talking in the breakout room earlier, and we were talking about the fact that there's definitely a bit of, backlash is maybe too strong a word, but I feel that there's a sense of, from some males, here we go, here's another workplace issue that's about women. What about us? And I've read some of the feedback when organizations have also introduced sort of menstrual leave and menopause leave policies. Here we go again, women get something else that we don't get, what about us, type thing, which is another factor. But as Deb quite correctly said, well, women go through the menopause. That is just a fact. And it doesn't mean that men don't have other medical conditions, but it's not like every male gets a medical condition at a particular age. And you would certainly hope that from a health and wellbeing perspective, an employer would be just as open to discussing any medical condition a male was having and how that impacted on their work. In the same way they would with menopause related issues.
Just a really good question there. Thank you. What should a person do if they do feel uncomfortable? Well, it's a bit like, I think, the mental health scenario, where it is up to you to decide, do I feel safe to raise this, within my culture? Is it impacting my work? Do I think I've got a good chance, etc.? So, you're not obliged to speak up. But if you do want to, because you feel like, look, a few simple things would make a difference, I think because it's still an unfamiliar topic, if you can grab some material, and I can help with that, educate your manager first. Monash Uni have created a really good conversation tool that can be used between manager and employee. Give them a bit of education, flag it ahead of time, and you can structure your conversation. This is what I'm experiencing, completely normal part of, this transition. This is how it's impacting my work, and come with your own ideas. This is what I think would make a difference. Can we work on that? That would be my suggestion.
And if you don't feel comfortable going to your direct manager, I'd like to think that somebody in HR, that's the very reason they're there, to help support employees and management. But there would be somebody in HR who would at least understand that it was a serious issue, and that you could seek some guidance from them on whether they'd be willing to become involved in the discussion, or whether they have any suggestions on how you approach it with your manager.
Yeah. And also just that other point you raised, Nicola, about sometimes the men might be saying, oh, here's another thing for women. But the really neat thing is when you look at the adjustments that could be made, it's actually going to be good for all of your staff, because apart from hot flushes, the top symptoms that women complain about are fatigue is number one, and a big chunk of the rest of your workforce is going to be tired. Insomnia, 1 in 3 have trouble sleeping. Mental health, 1 in 5. Things like anxiety. So at the end of the day, you're actually not doing this really highly gender-specific stuff. It ends up being good for everyone.
I think there was just a comment in the chat box from Deb. If we just go up a little bit, she was wondering whether we have examples of policies or any other resources available to use as examples.
Yeah, we do. And just on that, I was hoping to have it ready for today, but I'm just about to launch my new website where there's a whole stack of resources and tip sheets and posters and templates. Feel free to get in touch afterwards. Should be ready next week for International Women's Day. Yeah. Just in the last minute or two, does anyone want to make a comment about something that they spoke about or were interested in learning more about, or what they might take away? Anything at all? I know now.
All I would say is, as someone who's possibly a bit younger, I think the absence of a discussion about menopause in the workplace goes to the broader picture that at least in the Australian landscape, people are put into management positions without training on how to be a manager. You're technically good at something, and so you get moved up, and often people aren't equipped to have these discussions or even think about it. So I think it's part of this broad conversation about people that have quite a lot of responsibility for people's experience at work, getting the tools that they need, and this should be part of that.
Good point. And when I've looked at some of the cases in the UK that have gone to court, it really boils down to the employer didn't understand their obligations, and the manager wasn't educated and didn't actually know what to say or do. So that's where that building the capability of the manager is really important. Yeah. Thank you. Thanks, Amelia. Yeah. In our group, the other person mentioned that she was actually glad to see that there are starting to be some resources out there in an area which has been pretty under-resourced. Anyone else got any final comments before we start to wrap up? No, that's all good. So as mentioned, just a few takeaways in terms of what's coming up. These events are run quarterly, so I'll keep you notified about the next date and topic. But if you have a particular topic you would like to focus on, or some work that you would like to showcase, it doesn't have to be fully developed or amazing. It's just about sharing what we're doing. Please do let me know. Next week, I will have the new Menopause at Work website all ready with a whole stack of new resources. So I'll send you a link to look at there. And don't forget these free downloads, which might just help you start the conversation at work. An International Women's Day, which is next week, could be a great opportunity to do that. For those of you that don't know, it's also World Menopause Day on October the 18th, and that's also within Mental Health Month, and it's a great opportunity to talk about mental health and menopause if any of you need an excuse to put it on your calendars. So thanks so much for showing up today. We had a small group, but it's nice to be able to chat. But I do want to just throw back to Nicola, and I'm going to stop my share here. If anyone does need or want to follow up with Nicola at any time, Nicola, would you like to put up your details? And I also noticed on your slide, Nicola, you had some resources there. Is that something that I can email out to participants?
Yeah, certainly. Yeah, I'm just trying to check if my contact details. Oh, yes, they are. Hang on. Let me just share the slide again. Oh, technology's potentially not. There we go.
Your friend today.
Friend. Share. And always good old Google if need be, or LinkedIn.
Yes.
Love to connect with you all on LinkedIn. There you go.
Great. So we'll leave that up, and I'll also send that in the email when we send out the recording. So lovely to connect. Nicola and I are happy to hang around here just for a moment or two before we log off. But have a great rest of your day.
Thank you.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you. That was really great. Thank you.
Thank you.